April 1945. The Rhine River Valley is a ruin. Smoke hangs over shattered towns, and the smell of gunpowder lingers in the cold, damp air. German soldiers, weary and disheartened, move through the rubble-strewn streets, their uniforms torn, faces smeared with dirt and fear. The distant roar of artillery echoes across the plains. From the horizon, American tanks and infantry advance steadily, their presence a stark contrast to the chaos around them. The Allied forces are disciplined, well-fed, and organized. For German troops, the choice is clear: surrender or face annihilation. Small groups emerge from hiding, waving white flags, carrying what little arms they still possess. Officers signal to their men, urging them to move quickly toward the lines. In towns once bustling with life, civilians peek from shattered windows. The desperation of the German soldiers is palpable. They are exhausted, surrounded, and fully aware that the war they once believed in is over. Each step toward the Americans carries both hope and uncertainty, a final gamble for survival in a collapsing Reich. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was crumbling. Soviet forces pressed from the east, capturing cities and advancing relentlessly toward Berlin. On the Western Front, American and British armies had crossed the Rhine, rolling through Germany with overwhelming speed and firepower. The German army, once feared for its discipline and mechanized prowess, was now fractured. Supply lines were disrupted, communication was erratic, and morale had collapsed. German troops faced impossible odds. Many were young conscripts or worn veterans who had survived years of brutal campaigns across Europe. Food was scarce, ammunition limited, and winter had left its mark on both body and mind. Encirclement by Allied forces was common. Units were cut off from command, and surrender became not just an option, but a necessity for survival. In this environment, the Americans were viewed differently than the Soviets. Reports filtered back from German soldiers who had encountered both forces. Surrendering to Americans offered a greater chance of humane treatment, whereas the advancing Red Army was feared for reprisals and harsh retribution. The psychological state of the German soldier was a mix of fear, pragmatism, and disbelief. Orders from Berlin were often meaningless, and propaganda clashed with reality. Soldiers knew the war was lost, yet ideological conditioning, fear of punishment, and hope for mercy created a tense, fractured mindset. Small groups moved cautiously, testing American lines, waving white flags, or sending envoys under truce. Commanders sometimes urged compliance. Others hesitated, torn between honor, duty, and the survival instinct. American forces, by contrast, were organized, well-supplied, and advancing with clear objectives. Infantry and armored units worked in concert, while artillery and air support provided overwhelming firepower. The contrast between advancing Americans and the desperate, disorganized German units could not have been starker. These conditions created a situation where surrender, once a distant thought, became the most viable path forward for thousands of German soldiers. As April progressed, the collapse of German resistance accelerated. Cities that had once been strongholds fell with minimal fighting, often because units had already abandoned their positions. The American advance was relentless, supported by mechanized infantry, artillery, and armored divisions. Roads were clogged with refugees and retreating soldiers, creating chaos that German commanders could not control. Desperation mounted as the front lines dissolved into scattered pockets of resistance. The geography of Germany worked against the defenders. Rivers like the Rhine, once formidable barriers, were now crossed with relative ease by American engineers and tanks. Bridges had been destroyed, but for a force as resourceful as the Americans, temporary pontoon bridges and captured crossings allowed armored units to maintain momentum. German troops, already exhausted and low on supplies, were forced into untenable positions. Those who might have held for a few days were quickly surrounded, their options narrowing by the hour. American policy and conduct also influenced German decisions to surrender. The U.S. military maintained standards of humane treatment for prisoners of war. Captured soldiers were processed, given food and medical care, and shielded from immediate frontline dangers. Word of this treatment spread among German units, reinforcing the belief that surrendering to Americans offered the best chance of survival. The contrast with encounters on the Eastern Front, where reports of harsh treatment and reprisals were common, made this decision starkly practical. By the final weeks of the war, surrender was no longer an act of shame, but a calculated decision. Entire regiments laid down arms voluntarily, marching toward American lines with raised hands. The desperation of German soldiers was both physical and psychological, a recognition that the world they had fought for was gone, and survival required abandoning pride, ideology, and hope of victory. The stage was set for widespread capitulation, as thousands of soldiers chose life under American custody over the chaos and danger that awaited elsewhere. The story of German troops surrendering to Americans in 1945 can be examined through multiple angles, each revealing a different dimension of the conflict. The human angle is immediate and visceral. Soldiers were exhausted, malnourished, and psychologically drained after years of continuous combat. Many were teenagers or middle-aged men drafted in the final years of the war, ill-prepared for frontline realities. Desperation dominated their thoughts. Surrendering to Americans was not only a choice of survival, but also a recognition of the futility of continued resistance. Eyewitness accounts describe trembling hands, tear-streaked faces, and soldiers whispering prayers as they approached American lines with white flags. The act of surrender was profoundly human, a blend of fear, relief, and a faint glimmer of hope in an otherwise hopeless situation. The tactical angle highlights the imbalance on the battlefield. American forces were well supplied, coordinated, and advancing relentlessly. Mechanized infantry, tanks, artillery, and air support operated in seamless integration. German units, by contrast, were fragmented, low on ammunition, and often isolated from command. When faced with overwhelming firepower, surrender became a rational choice. Tactical superiority meant that the Americans could encircle German positions, cutting off any chance of effective resistance. For German soldiers, waving the white flag was not cowardice. It was an acknowledgement of reality on a battlefield where further resistance would lead only to death or capture under worse conditions. The psychological angle is crucial to understanding the phenomenon. By 1945, decades of indoctrination and propaganda clashed with stark reality. Soldiers had been told of heroic last stands and promised victory, yet now found themselves surrounded, hungry, and fearful. The American advance, disciplined and predictable, offered a semblance of order amidst chaos. Knowing that surrender to Americans meant food, medical attention, and relative safety reshaped mental calculations. In contrast, the feared Soviet forces represented unknown danger, revenge, and chaos. This mental calculus drove countless German units to seek out the Americans, sometimes walking miles through destroyed. Moral and psychological release. Soldiers experienced relief and guilt simultaneously. Relief at escaping death, guilt for abandoning orders, or comrades still fighting. This complex interplay of emotion reveals the profound human cost of prolonged warfare. From a strategic angle, the mass surrender of German units accelerated the Allied advance. Instead of protracted battles, the Americans often gained control of towns, bridges, and roads with minimal resistance. Capturing large numbers of enemy soldiers without prolonged combat allowed the Allies to focus resources elsewhere, maintain momentum, and reduce casualties. The surrender phenomenon, therefore, was not merely tactical. It reshaped operational planning and contributed directly to the speed at which Allied forces penetrated deeper into German territory. Finally, the logistical and organizational angle highlights American efficiency in handling prisoners of war. Surrendering soldiers were quickly processed, given food, medical care, and shelter. This systematic approach reinforced the pattern of capitulation, as German units recognized that surrender was orderly and survivable. Additionally, managing large numbers of prisoners without chaos demonstrated the logistical superiority of the Americans, further encouraging German troops to seek surrender over futile resistance. Through these angles, the pattern of German surrender becomes clear. Human vulnerability, tactical disparity, psychological pressure, strategic calculation, and logistical organization all converged. By April 1945, surrendering to Americans had become the rational, albeit desperate, choice for countless German soldiers facing the collapse of the Third Reich. The final weeks of the war revealed the full scale of German desperation. By mid-April 1945, American forces were pressing into central Germany, capturing towns with little resistance. German units, scattered and exhausted, faced overwhelming firepower and the certainty of encirclement. In countless villages and crossroads, small groups of soldiers emerged cautiously from hiding, waving white flags in surrender. One striking moment occurred near the town of Leipzig. American reconnaissance units reported hundreds of German soldiers, armed and disoriented, approaching along narrow streets. Officers directed them to halt, drop their weapons, and assemble in orderly lines. The scene was surreal. Battle-hardened troops, once fierce defenders of the Reich, now moving in silence, eyes downcast, hands raised. Tanks and infantry watched as the surrender unfolded, ensuring security while avoiding unnecessary violence. Elsewhere, along the Rhine, entire battalions chose capitulation over futile resistance. German commanders, recognizing the futility of further fighting, instructed their men to seek out American lines. Radio broadcasts and field messages were ignored in favor of immediate survival. Soldiers navigated minefields, ruined bridges, and shell-scarred roads, driven by the single objective of reaching American custody. The psychological impact on both sides was palpable. American soldiers, trained for combat, now found themselves processing thousands of prisoners. German troops, conversely, experienced a complex mix of relief and shame. For many, surrender was not just a physical act, but a symbolic acknowledgement of defeat. These events crystallized the turning point of the European theater. Not a single battle, but the cumulative effect of exhaustion, isolation, and the unmistakable dominance of American forces, compelling the German army to lay down arms en masse. By late April 1945, surrender became a widespread phenomenon across Germany. In towns such as Magdeburg and Hanover, American forces reported thousands of soldiers arriving in organized columns, white flags held high. The American response was methodical. Prisoners were disarmed, registered, and moved to temporary holding areas where they received food, medical attention, and shelter. The scale of surrender was unprecedented, reflecting the total collapse of German resistance. In rural areas, small detachments of Wehrmacht soldiers, previously cut off from supply lines, made similar choices. Forests and farmsteads, once used as defensive positions, became zones of surrender. Groups of soldiers cautiously approached American patrols, signaling their intentions with gestures or improvised flags. The Americans, recognizing the strategic advantage, allowed orderly capitulations, which prevented unnecessary firefights and preserved both manpower and momentum. One particularly telling instance occurred near the Ruhr Valley, where thousands of German troops, trapped by converging Allied forces, opted for surrender rather than annihilation. Their movements were disciplined, almost military in order, despite the chaos surrounding them. Officers coordinated with American units to ensure that their men could surrender safely, reflecting a final acknowledgement that survival took precedence over ideology. These moments underscored the human dimension of surrender. Fear, pragmatism, and the hope for life outweighed loyalty to a collapsing regime. By the end of April, surrender was no longer sporadic but systemic. The collapse of the German military apparatus, combined with the overwhelming presence of American forces and the promise of humane treatment, created a situation where capitulation became the default choice. German soldiers were no longer fighting the enemy. They were negotiating for life, moving toward an uncertain but preferable future under Allied custody. The European theater had reached its decisive turning point, where the mere presence of organized, well-supplied American troops compelled mass surrender and ensured the rapid conclusion of the war. The surrender of German troops to American forces had immediate and far-reaching consequences. Tens of thousands of soldiers laid down their weapons, creating a sudden influx of prisoners of war. For the Americans, this was both a logistical challenge and a strategic advantage. Large-scale surrenders allowed the Allies to occupy territory with minimal resistance, preserving infrastructure and reducing casualties. It also accelerated the collapse of remaining German defensive positions, as the surrender of one unit often prompted neighboring units to follow suit. For the German soldiers, surrender was a mixture of relief, fear, and uncertainty. They were often exhausted, malnourished, and psychologically drained from years of continuous combat. Captivity under American forces promised basic necessities: food, medical attention, and shelter, offering a stark contrast to the chaos and destruction of the front lines. Many soldiers viewed surrender as the only viable option to survive the final weeks of a lost war, a pragmatic choice that superseded pride or ideology. The impact on German command structures was profound. Officers faced the dilemma of maintaining authority over increasingly disorganized and demoralized troops. Some encouraged surrender to save lives. Others hesitated, fearing repercussions or dishonor. The resulting breakdown of command contributed to further capitulations. German morale, already weakened, disintegrated rapidly. Individual units became isolated, unable to mount coherent resistance, and often followed the lead of nearby groups, choosing to surrender. From the American perspective, handling mass surrenders required careful coordination. Temporary camps were established to manage the influx of prisoners, while officers ensured that the process remained orderly. This humane treatment of captives fostered compliance and reduced the likelihood of rebellion or escape. Strategically, surrender minimized further bloodshed, preserved manpower, and allowed the Allies to consolidate gains rapidly. By the time Germany officially capitulated, the landscape was defined as much by the orderly surrender of its troops to Americans as by the battles themselves. The surrender of German troops to American forces in 1945 represents one of the most profound moments of human decision in modern warfare. It was a convergence of fear, pragmatism, and hope, a recognition that survival outweighed ideology, loyalty, or pride. Across shattered towns, muddy fields, and ruined villages, soldiers made a conscious choice to step away from destruction and toward a future defined not by victory, but by life itself. This episode underscores the complex interplay of human psychology and military strategy. American forces, disciplined, well-supplied, and organized, created conditions in which surrender became a rational and viable option. Their systematic processing of prisoners, combined with promises of humane treatment, reshaped the battlefield before a single shot was fired in many locations. Conversely, the collapse of German command, shortages of resources, and the psychological toll of sustained defeat amplified the inevitability of surrender. In historical terms, these mass capitulations accelerated the end of the European conflict, rather than prolonging battles that would have caused unnecessary casualties on both sides. Surrender allowed the Allies to secure territory efficiently and preserve life. Yet, beyond numbers and strategy, the events highlight a universal truth of warfare. The human instinct for survival can supersede even deeply ingrained loyalty or ideology. As the Rhine valleys and cities fell silent, the surrendered German troops became living witnesses to the end of a regime, a war, and an era. Their choice to yield was not weakness. It was a testament to the enduring human desire for life amidst the chaos of destruction. History remembers these moments not only for the movements of armies, but for the quiet courage of individuals who, facing the collapse of their world, chose survival and, in doing so, shaped the final chapter of World War II.